I know that sounds cold-blooded. I know that it sounds very calculating, but the reality is, again, the universities are doing what is in their best interest. Hello, and welcome to the Admittedly podcast. My name is Thomas Caleel. I'm the former director of MBA admissions and financial aid for my alma mater, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. In this podcast, I don't promise easy answers or quick fixes, but I will use my decades of experience to help you achieve your education goals. Now let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Admittedly podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Caleel, and as we're moving deeper into season 4, let's talk today about deferrals. Deferrals are something that has been just burning up my inbox, my DMs, my comments. People are stressed. So what I want to do is walk you through the deferral process, talk to you a little bit about why schools might defer you, and hopefully give you some insight into this to help alleviate concern, because it's something that's very stressful. I get it, absolutely 100%. So let's talk about what is a deferral. Well, deferrals usually come when you're applying early decision, early action, restrictive early action, and what it means is that they're not denying you. They're giving you another look in the regular decision round. But why would a school want to do that? Well, first of all, and I want to just put a fork in this right up front, a deferral is not a rejection. I see a lot of comments, people talking about things that they're not particularly well-versed on. Oh, you're totally rejected. It's not going to happen. They never take deferred candidates. That is not true at all. In fact, deferred candidates are in a fairly strong position. It depends every year how much they accept, how many they don't accept. But the reality is you are 100% being considered in the regular decision pool. But let's take a step back, right? And I did a long form reel on this that I really urge you to go listen to. Because why would a school defer you? Well, primarily they do it because of yield management and also to give themselves the best pool in regular decision. Here's something we're going to talk about over and over again, and that's that the schools act in their best interest. Don't be mad about that. You act in your own best interest too. You apply to the schools that you think will admit you. You apply to the schools you think would be the best fit for you. You apply to schools that you think will do the best job in accelerating your career and helping you achieve your goals. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Self-interest is not a bad thing. It's what drives you. It's what motivates you. Well, likewise, the schools act in their best interest, and they do the things that is best for them. As a head of admissions, yield, right? And what is yield? Yield is the number of students who accept your offer over the number of offers that you've given out. Yield is immensely important, right? If the university says to you, hey, Thomas, you can admit a class of 1,000 students, right? You need to admit a class of 1,000 students. If you admit a class of 900 students, you're in trouble because you're 100 students short. There's 100 empty seats. Professors are not happy. University misses its revenue goals. That's a bad situation. Another bad situation is if you admit 1,100 students, because now there's not enough space. Where are they going to live? The dorms are full. How are they going to get access to classes? Because getting access to classes is highly competitive and seats are in short supply. So as a director or dean of admissions, you have a very serious charge to land that number on the nose. And there's ways to do that. Now, let's look at the early pool. The early pool comes in, and as the head of admissions, you say, okay, here are our priorities this year. Here is how we want the class to look, give or take. And in that early round, you might have students that you need to take, right? You might have some athletes that you need recruited. You might have some musicians to fill some critical holes in the university. You might have some legacy students. You might have some underrepresented groups or first-gen groups that you really want to make sure you lock in to the university, right? That is part of what you're doing. You're sending a message. If it's early decision, obviously they're locked in, they're fully committed to you, and they're coming. If it's early action, what you're doing is sending a message to them that they are valuable, they are valued, and you really want them there. And that first indication, it creates kind of a mental feedback loop in the student where they're like, oh, I got into this school. I got into Yale. I'm going to go there, right? And they look at the mountain of regular decision applications they were going to do, and they're like, okay, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to enjoy my senior year. Yale it is. And I know some of you are laughing right now because you're like, if I got into Yale, I wouldn't even consider anything else. I'm done. But we're just talking here for the sake of argument. So, okay. So now when we've gotten that core, that kernel of the class, what do we do with everybody else? Now I see a lot of comments saying, why don't you just admit them, right? Because you could admit more of them and fill your class up early. Well, there are reasons students don't apply early, especially early decision. Early decision is challenging for some students because you have no opportunity to negotiate financial aid. And financial aid can be a very critical part of your decision process. And so if you want the most diverse class, like especially socioeconomic diversity, if you fill your class early decision, a lot of those students who were hesitant to apply because they didn't want to get locked into a financial aid package that they couldn't afford, you'll miss them and you're missing out on a lot. So you'll admit a certain percentage of your class, maybe 30%, maybe a little over 50%. It varies year to year, school to school, but you do admit a core group of your class. Same thing with early action, although with early action, students have the option to apply to different schools and maximize their financial aid opportunities, right? But now you've got this big pool of students that you didn't admit for whatever reason. So what do you do with them, right? Well, you can deny them or you can defer them. And if you defer them, what does that do? Deferring them means that you put them in the regular decision pool. And now when you go to regular decision, right, you step back as the director of admissions, the admissions committee, and you say, okay, who did we admit early? Great. What are we trying to get the class to look like? Now, where are our gaps? And we're going to look at what our gaps are, and we're going to look at the regular decision pool and start pulling people up from the regular decision pool to admit them to fill those gaps. Now, the other thing that you're doing in the early rounds, especially for like early decision, early action, when you're deferring, you're doing some probability analysis. And you're looking at a student, you're saying, okay, what is the probability that if I defer them, I'll lose them? Right? Because if you really need them, you're going to grab them early. But if you don't really need them and you say, you know what, they're from a demographic that we're going to see a lot of in regular decision, so there's no need for us to use one of our very precious limited resources, which is a seat in this class. Now, I know that sounds cold-blooded. I know that it sounds very calculating, but the reality is, again, the universities are doing what is in their best interest. They need to maximize their returns and get the best class possible. And on the other side, so that we can give some perspective from the university standpoint, students will say anything to get admitted. Right? And they will look you right in the eye and say, literally face to face across the table and say, if you admit me, I will matriculate right now. And sometimes they matriculate and then they withdraw when they get an offer from a school that they like more. Sometimes you'll give them the offer and you never hear from them again. So everybody is acting in their own self-interest. So it's best not to get mad about it, but understand the way the game is played. So sometimes schools get it wrong. Sometimes they'll look at a student and they'll say, okay, high probability they're going to matriculate if we admit them RD. They admit them regular decision, but by that point, that student has already been admitted to other programs that are great programs. And they're like, you know what? I'm going to go to this other program, whether they have a bad taste in their mouth from the original deferral or whether they just were admitted to another program that's a better fit. Sometimes you lose them. A great example of this is my student Dami, and her full story is available on our website, and I encourage you to check it out. But she applied early to Yale and was deferred. So we geared up, we hit regular decision hard, and she ended up getting in pretty much everywhere she applied. Almost all the Ivy Plus, just absolutely killed the process. And Yale got really nervous, and they were like, oh my gosh, we really dropped the ball here. And so they started courting her really hard. Right? But of course, all the other schools were courting her hard. And we had some long conversations around what she truly wanted. And in the end, she decided, you know what, hurt feelings aside, Yale is truly where I want to be. And she ended up matriculating there. But yes, schools definitely drop the ball on this, and sometimes they pay the price. But The other thing when I talk about yield management is schools are critically focused on their yield. It's a really big indicator of how selective they are. And so what they try and do too is assess, will this student come if we give them the opportunity? And that's one of the reasons they have the letters of continued interest. If you're deferred, many schools give you an opportunity to write what's called a letter of letter of continued interest. And the LOCI basically says, give us an update on what's happened since you last applied. And the way you want to structure that is you wanted to talk about, yes, what has happened. You do want to make sure that your school counselor sends in your grades. And then you want to talk a little bit about fit. This is not a love letter. Please do not write a letter about the esteemed faculty and the wonderful students and the beautiful campus. There's no place for that, right? Some schools like Michigan will even limit you to 250 words. This is about your specific fit to the specific program at the specific school where you're applying. So do your homework, do your research, be specific, be clear, and really kind of clarify and sharpen up. I want to be here. This is the place for me. Will they always believe you? Not necessarily, but a well-written letter of continued interest can make a huge difference. Great example of this was my student who had applied to Penn, got deferred, wanted to be an astrophysicist, and in conversation with him, realized that he actually was really into extraterrestrial life, not the kind of like Discovery Channel, little green men kind of thing, aliens kind of a thing, but much more of like, I want to be the scientist that proves using scientific data and methodology that extraterrestrial life exists. And he traced it back to this experience he had as a child. And I was like, why didn't you tell me this before? This is your story. And so we wrote a letter of continued interest to Penn, basically saying, hey, listen, I dropped the ball. I didn't have the courage to tell my true story in the original application. But here's the truth. Here's the reality of why I want to study this. And we also reconfigured his personal statement. He got into several Ivies, decided to matriculate at Penn, graduated, was just an absolute star there. So a letter of continued interest, correctly written and well positioned, can make a material difference in the outcome of regular decision. So there's one other thing I want to talk about, and I want to caveat this by saying this is absolute pure conjecture. This is my own theory, having been in admissions now for 20 years. This is not something that I've heard. This is not something I've seen anywhere else. This is very unique. I believe that one reason deferrals have spiked so much this year is that schools want to mitigate the emotional and psychological trauma of an early deny. What do I mean? Well, I've worked with students for a long time, and I can tell you this. When students in the middle of December get a denial letter, it guts them. The world stops, the floor drops out from underneath them, and they start to question their sanity. And they're like, I'm not getting in anywhere. Now, rationally, they understand I applied REA to Stanford. My probability of success is tiny. Like they know that intellectually, but emotionally, it's gutting. And so that really makes them sometimes make poor decisions. Angry parents, angry alumni blow up the switchboards. They're calling in, they're lobbying, they're yelling and screaming and just really making life miserable too for the admissions officers. And so personally, I think that the schools realized, you know what? We gain nothing by denying these students. Nothing at all except a headache. We make them upset. We cause ourselves a lot more grief and anxiety and work. And so if we just defer them, then if we deny them in regular decision, hopefully by that point, they'll have gotten several admissions. They'll be less focused on us. When they get our denial, they'll be able to just say, well, I didn't really want you anyway. And it will sting a lot less. Again, my personal theory, but anecdotally, it really, a lot of the behavior that we're seeing with these schools doing mass deferrals really seems to support that. So bottom line, deferrals are not denials. You are very much in the hunt. I want you to keep your academics super sharp. I want you to remain engaged with your extracurricular activities. I want you to write a sharp, crisp, to the point letter of continued interest that is not a love letter, that you've done your research and that you're smart about, and just keep the faith and keep focused. If you have questions about deferrals or if you have an experience with a deferral, drop it in our socials at AdmittedlyCo on Instagram and TikTok. We'd love to hear from you, and other students will benefit from your experience. Thank you.